We're not at war, so why do we talk as though we are? Military metaphors are really common in medicine. That's obviously true in a pandemic, but it goes beyond that. It's not uncommon to hear about brave struggles against cancer, and fighting infection is so second nature that it's easy to forget that that's even a metaphor. In this episode, we're going to be talking about why we do it, why sometimes it's helpful, and why sometimes it might be less helpful.
Because if there's one thing I know about this Prime Minister, he's a fighter.
This one's a little bit less vloggy because I've not been out that much recently. I thought it was an interesting topic for a video though, so let's crack on.
So first things first, this episode isn't about coronavirus, it's not about pandemics, it's about the way we talk about medicine, about the way we talk about healthcare and the metaphors we use. We do sometimes talk about pandemics as though they are wars, and that's one example to use as a springboard for how we talk about medicine more generally and the metaphors we use in other illnesses. So why do we talk like that, and is it useful? Well, there's clearly a comparison to be had between the COVID-19 pandemic and the response and the whole situation and a war.
This is, in effect, a government on a wartime footing, a government calling for a collective national effort, as Boris Johnson would do, quotes, whatever it takes.
There are a lot of similarities between a war and a pandemic situation. They are both emergency situations. They're both recognised as tier 1 threats to national security. But is a war metaphor really that useful? I'm not that convinced that it's a particularly good or useful metaphor. Now, the front line's the most obvious one. It conjures up images of soldiers on the front line, of trenches and trench warfare, and our boys ready to go over the top in the Great War. Now, there might be a bit more of a similarity there than Boris Johnson would like to admit. But I'm not here to criticise or talk about the pandemic response, that's another story. But the front line isn't really a metaphor. It's not a literal line, but it is a description of people in direct contact with the threat. Threat, not enemy. Talking about frontline healthcare workers in a pandemic isn't a metaphor any more than talking about frontline soldiers in a war would be a pandemic metaphor. They're both frontline responders to their situation, not a metaphor. Similarly with the volunteers, it's an emergency. We need extra people to do extra things. It's an extraordinary situation. It calls for extraordinary measures. But that doesn't mean that we need a war metaphor. War metaphors can sometimes be unhelpful as well, because metaphors give you a good way of helping to visualise things and helping you to think about things. But by helping you to think about things, sometimes they can kind of put you on a track which might not be the most helpful.
And I'm confident he'll pull through. Because if there's one thing I know about this Prime Minister, he's a fighter.
That statement is as idiotic as it is insensitive. Clearly, there is no correlation between being a fighter and surviving, and that comparison is where everything can go wrong. The problem is saying Boris Johnson will survive because he's a fighter. That suggests that people who don't survive aren't fighters. That suggests that people who haven't been fighters haven't fought enough. It almost puts some kind of blame, which is awful and clearly untrue. And that's the stupid end that you can find yourself at if you're not careful. Now, you might say it's a virus, fighting the virus, it makes sense as a metaphor. Maybe it does to some degree, but I don't really think it makes any more sense than to say, if there's a flood, then we need to declare war on the sea. It's not only nonsense, it's unhelpful. We don't need war on the sea, we don't need to destroy the sea, we need construction to help think about how we can restructure things to help. And I think that that's partly what it comes down to. Hospitals aren't places of destruction. We don't need to be fighting things in the pandemic. Hospitals are places of care. You don't need images of soldiers to visualise the commitment of healthcare workers. You just need images of hospitals. And hospitals aren't for fighting, they're not for destruction, they're for curing, they're for caring, they're for healing and repairing. That rhymed a bit, didn't it? The point is that they're for the exact opposite of war, and framing things in one way, sometimes by setting you off on that mindset and that track, can close down the way that you think about things and it can lead to stupid ways of thinking and talking about things.
He's a fighter.
And that's an extreme example, but I think that you can take something from that about the way we talk about healthcare and illness more generally. Take cancer metaphors, for example. I'm definitely not saying that military metaphors with cancer are stupid. Some people find talking about fighting cancer very helpful. Fine, if that works for you. But I think that it can sometimes cause some problems. Cancer is difficult to talk about. In days gone by, doctors, family wouldn't have spoken about cancer. People wouldn't say the word. People wouldn't tell the person that had cancer they had cancer. They'd keep it a secret from them. As that became less acceptable, then we'd talk about it, but still euphemistically. People talk about the big C. Some people still talk about the big C. There's still a bit of hesitancy around it, though. And the thing is, by talking euphemistically, then you can kind of cushion it a little bit. You can take away some of the harshness, which is a good thing. But by doing that, sometimes you can make it a bit more difficult to actually get to the heart of something, which sometimes we need to do. So there's a time and a place for those kind of cushioning, softening euphemisms, but also there's a time to get to the point. So what about military metaphors? Well, we talk about brave people fighting their cancer, and it kind of brings to mind this heroic, valiant struggle, which some people seem to find helpful in terms of teeing up treatment, for example, and gives you the idea that you are going to have to go through a difficult process. But sometimes it almost comes back to that Boris Johnson thing, that if you don't fight hard enough, you don't get better, and if you don't get better, it means that you haven't fought hard enough, which is clearly nonsense. And if you're adding that to the illness, it can be awful. Being able to talk about fighting something gives you the idea that you can control it, to some degree at least. That thing about control is really important. The idea that you lose control of everything is terrifying and unhelpful and untrue. If you're ill with cancer, for example, there is some control that you have over the situation and your body and life and sometimes death. Whether that's in terms of treatment, what you do with your life, what you do. You have control over your action. But the acceptance of some loss of control can be very positive. To think, well, actually, what I do with my time, what treatment I engage with, that is your control, and that is very positive to make the most of it. But what the cancer cells in your body do, how they respond to that treatment, is beyond your control. And to think that you're not fighting hard enough when those cells don't respond to chemotherapy, it's adding insult to injury. And sometimes accepting that limitation of control can be like lifting a burden. Apart from anything else, it's a very aggressive metaphor, and I can't help but wonder, do you really want to spend your life at war? And obviously it's only a metaphor, but it still relates to how you feel about things. If you do, if you find that helpful, more power to you. But don't think that it's the only way of thinking about things, and don't feel like you need to be pushed into it. A lot of people can slip into it because it's such a common way of talking. Anecdotally, there does seem to be some difference between whether men or women prefer war metaphors for this kind of thing. Have a guess who prefers what? War metaphors work to varying degrees for different illnesses. It seems natural to talk about infections. You've got an invading microbe. You've got your army of white blood cells fighting off the infection. Well, yeah, that does make sense as a metaphor, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the problem is just that track that it can lead us down. And also, for the case of infection, it is such a good metaphor that it's easy to forget that it is and to allow it to seep out in other ways without even clocking that you're talking in a metaphor. Because at the end of the day, microbes aren't invading. They're not trying to subjugate or overthrow or whatever. They're not trying to force their evil agenda on you. When you look at war, there is clearly a moral aspect to it. Say what you will of it, and that's a whole story for another day. But there is conflict amongst humans. There's agency involved. An infection, whether it's a one-off thing, whether you've got pneumonia or whether there's a global pandemic. There's no agency, there's no intent. A microbe isn't evil. COVID-19 is more like a natural disaster. COVID-19 is more like the sea. It's more like saying, let's declare war on the sea because of a flood. It's not helpful. It's an emergency. It's not a war. So when we're talking about medicine, disease, illness, whether it's a pandemic or cancer or anything else, just be mindful of the metaphors that you use and the words that you choose to use to describe things. Sometimes metaphors can be really positive and help us visualize things in a better way, but sometimes they can put us on a track that might not be helpful. Let me know what you think to different kinds of metaphors and whether they're useful, whether they're positive or negative. What do you think to the war footing of the lockdown? What do you think to war metaphors in cancer or other treatment? If you've had experience with this, let me know in the comments below. It's really good to hear from you about this kind of thing. Anyway, that's more than enough for today. I've been avoiding making anything about the pandemic because there's so much out there and it's just a bit overwhelming. I thought it'd be interesting to do a slightly different spin on it. Tell me what you think. If you found it interesting, subscribe, click the like button. I'm releasing videos semi-regularly, so I'll be putting one out soon. If you click the bell icon, then you'll get a notification sent through when that comes out. And I'll see you then. Oh, and share the links. No one sees the channel if you don't share the links. This is the way YouTube works. People need to get sent the links for the channel to take off. So send the links to people and share it. Share the love.